Picture this scenario. You wake up in the morning feeling clear, grounded, almost peaceful. By noon, you're irritable and exhausted for no reason you can identify. By evening, you're so drained you can barely hold a conversation. Nothing bad happened to you. No crisis, no conflict, no traumatic event. You just move through your day the way you always do. And somehow, your day consumed you from the inside out. Carl Jung would tell you that you didn't lose your energy. It was taken from you through channels you don't even know are open. And the reason you feel destroyed by ordinary life isn't because you're weak. It's because your nervous system is doing work that most people's nervous systems never have to do. And you've never been taught how to replenish what that work costs you. Jung spent decades studying the specific energy dynamics of empaths, and what he found was counterintuitive. Empaths don't have less energy than other people. They actually have enormous reserves. The problem is that their energy is being constantly redirected outward through unconscious processes they were never taught to manage. Their life force bleeds into every room they enter, every conversation they have, every emotional field they pass through. Not because they choose to give it away, but because their nervous system was wired in childhood to scan, absorb, and process the emotional environment at all times. That scanning never stops, and it costs more energy than most people burn in an entire day of physical labor. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. There are specific daily practices that don't just slow the energy drain, but actively reverse it. Not meditation retreats or weekend workshops. Daily rituals so simple they seem almost too basic to work. Yet Jung found that empaths who adopted these practices experienced a transformation in their energy levels that bordered on dramatic. They went from barely surviving their days to having surplus energy they didn't know what to do with. And the shift happened not over months or years, but within days of consistent practice. Today I'm going to show you the 7 daily rituals Jung identified that restore an empath's energy, why each one works on a psychological and nervous system level, and why you've probably been doing the opposite of what actually helps without realizing it. The first ritual Jung identified was what he called the morning separation practice. Most empaths start their day already behind, because the first thing they do upon waking is reach for their phone. They check messages, scroll through social media, read the news, and within 60 seconds of opening their eyes, they've absorbed the emotional frequencies of dozens of other people's realities. Their nervous system hasn't even fully come online yet, and it's already processing someone else's anxiety, outrage, grief, or drama. Jung observed that this single habit drained more energy from empaths than almost anything else in their day, because it occurred when the psyche was most permeable and least defended. The morning separation practice is the opposite of this. For the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking, you engage with nothing external. No phone, no news, no messages, no other people's content. Instead, you spend that time in contact with your own interior world. Jung emphasized that this wasn't about meditation in any formal sense, though meditation could be part of it. It was about giving your consciousness time to establish itself before it encounters the world. Think of it like allowing concrete to set before you walk on it. Your psyche needs time each morning to solidify its boundaries, reconnect with its own emotional baseline, and establish what Jung called the ego's center of gravity. Without that consolidation period, you walk into the world with a psyche that hasn't fully formed its container. Everything gets in because nothing has been secured. Jung found that empaths who practiced morning separation for even 2 weeks reported a dramatic difference in their daytime energy. They described feeling like they had a force field that hadn't been there before. What actually happened was simpler. They'd finally given their psyche the daily reset it needed to function as a boundaried system rather than an open one. The energy they used to spend all day trying to recover from that first 60 seconds of absorption was now available for their actual life. The second ritual was deliberate sensory grounding, and Jung was specific about why this worked differently for empaths than for anyone else. Empaths live primarily in the emotional and energetic dimensions of experience. Their attention is almost always directed toward invisible information, toward what people are feeling, what the atmosphere holds, what's happening beneath the surface. This means their consciousness spends very little time in the physical sensory present. And that imbalance is energetically devastating because the body is where energy is actually generated and stored, while the emotional field is where energy is spent and depleted. Deliberate sensory grounding means consciously redirecting attention to physical sensation multiple times throughout the day. The temperature of water on your hands, the texture of fabric against your skin, the specific taste of food in your mouth, the weight of your body in a chair. These aren't mindfulness exercises in the trendy sense. They're what Jung described as anchoring consciousness in the body, which is the empath's actual energy source. Every minute you spend in sensory awareness is a minute your nervous system isn't scanning the emotional environment and burning fuel it can't afford to lose. Jung observed something fascinating about empaths who practice sensory grounding consistently. Their empathic abilities didn't diminish. They actually became sharper and more accurate, because the empath was operating from a resourced, embodied state rather than a depleted, disembodied one. Their perception improved precisely because they were no longer running on empty while trying to process information. It's the difference between trying to see in the dark with a dying flashlight versus seeing clearly because your batteries are full. Grounding doesn't limit your perception. It powers it. The third ritual Jung identified surprised even his colleagues because it seemed to contradict conventional wisdom about empaths. He called it structured solitude. And it wasn't about being alone when you're exhausted. It was about being alone before you're exhausted. Scheduling specific daily periods of complete solitude not as recovery, but as preventive maintenance. Jung found that most empaths only retreated into solitude after they were already drained, which meant they spent their alone time recovering from depletion rather than building reserves. They were always playing catch-up and never getting ahead. Structured solitude means choosing a specific window each day, even 15 to 20 minutes, where you are completely alone with no input. No music, no podcasts, no background noise designed to fill silence. Just you in the quiet with your own thoughts. Jung discovered that during these periods, something remarkable happened in the empath's psyche. Without external emotional information to process, the nervous system began running what he compared to a defragmentation process. It sorted through accumulated emotional data from interactions, filed what was relevant, discharged what belonged to others, and restored the empath's energetic boundaries to their natural state. But here's the crucial distinction Jung made. This solitude had to be structured and intentional, not reactive. Collapsing on the couch after a terrible day isn't the same thing. That's crisis management. Structured solitude is like regular maintenance on a machine. You do it whether the machine seems to need it or not. because consistent maintenance prevents the breakdowns that come from running without pause. Empaths who schedule daily solitude before depletion found they rarely reach the state of total collapse that used to define their weeks. They had energy left at the end of the day because they had been maintaining their system all along instead of waiting for it to fail. The fourth ritual was what Jung called conscious emotional discharge, and this is where most empaths have been doing exactly the wrong thing for years. When empaths accumulate emotional energy from their environment, that energy doesn't just dissipate on its own. It stays in the body and nervous system like static electricity building on a conductor. Most empaths try to discharge this energy through rumination, through thinking about what they absorbed, analyzing it, trying to understand whose feelings they're carrying and why. But Jung found that cognitive processing of absorbed emotions actually locks the energy in place rather than releasing it. You're engaging the mind with material that needs to leave the body, and the mind's engagement prevents the discharge. Conscious emotional discharge bypasses cognition entirely and moves directly through the physical body. This can look like vigorous movement, shaking, dancing, even making sound. Jung documented that empaths who incorporated physical discharge practices into their daily routine, even for just 10 minutes, released accumulated emotional energy that would otherwise have taken days to process cognitively. The body knows how to release what doesn't belong to it if you let it move. Animals do this instinctively after stressful encounters. They shake, they run, they physically discharge the stress response. Humans have been socialized out of this instinct, and empaths pay the highest price for that socialization because they accumulate more emotional charge than anyone else. The practice is simple, but requires you to override self-consciousness. When you feel that heavy, accumulated energy from your day, don't sit down and try to think your way through it. Stand up and move. Shake your hands, your arms, your whole body. Put on music and move without choreography, without trying to look any particular way. Let your body do what it needs to do to discharge what it's carrying. Jung found that empaths who did this daily described the sensation as wringing out a wet towel. The heaviness literally left their body through movement, and what remained was their own clean energy, restored and available. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. The fifth ritual Jung documented was selective energy investment, and this one requires psychological honesty that most empaths find uncomfortable. Jung observed that empaths hemorrhaged enormous amounts of energy through what he called unconscious emotional philanthropy. They distributed their attention, care, empathy, and life force to virtually everyone they encountered, regardless of whether that investment was reciprocated, appreciated, or even wanted. The cashier at the grocery store, the coworker who always had a crisis, the friend who only called when they needed something, the family member who took without giving. The empath gave energy to all of them equally because they couldn't help it, or so they believed. Jung challenged this belief directly. He told empaths that their compulsive giving wasn't generosity. It was a survival pattern developed in childhood, where their safety depended on managing everyone's emotions. And continuing to distribute energy without discernment wasn't compassion. It was self-abandonment dressed up as virtue. The daily ritual of selective energy investment means consciously choosing every single day where your energy goes. Before each interaction, you make a brief internal assessment. Is this person someone who receives my energy and returns something to the exchange? Or is this someone who only withdraws from me without depositing anything back? This doesn't mean you become cold or withholding. It means you become honest about energy economics. Jung found that empaths who practice selective investment discovered something startling. They had been giving roughly 80% of their daily energy to people and situations that return nothing. When they redirected even half of that energy toward themselves and toward relationships that actually reciprocated, their available energy didn't just increase, it multiplied. Because energy that's invested in reciprocal connections generates more energy through the exchange, while energy poured into one-directional relationships vanishes entirely. The empath isn't gaining new energy through this practice. They're simply stopping the hemorrhage that was draining what they already had. The sixth ritual was what Jung called evening psychological inventory, and he considered this one of the most important practices an empath could adopt. At the end of each day, before sleep, the empath spends 5 to 10 minutes in a simple but specific review, not journaling in the elaborate sense, not processing emotions, just answering 3 internal questions with complete honesty. What did I feel today that was actually mine? What did I feel today that belonged to someone else? And what am I still carrying that I need to set down before sleep? Jung discovered that this practice accomplished something that no amount of daytime boundary setting could achieve. It taught the empath's unconscious mind to distinguish between self and other on an automatic level. When you consciously sort your emotional experience every evening, separating what originated in you from what you absorbed from your environment, you're training your psyche to make that distinction in real time. Over weeks and months of consistent practice, empaths found that the sorting started happening during the day instead of only at night. They'd be in conversation with someone and feel that person's anxiety arise, and instead of absorbing it automatically, their trained psyche would flag it immediately. That's theirs, not mine. The evening inventory also prevents what Jung called emotional accumulation debt. Without this nightly sorting, each day's unprocessed absorbed emotions carry over into the next day. After a week, you're carrying 7 days of unsorted emotional material. After a month, 30 days. This is why empaths often describe feeling like they're drowning in feelings they can't identify or trace to any source. They're carrying weeks or months of accumulated emotional debt from other people's lives. The evening inventory clears this debt daily so it never accumulates. You go to sleep having returned what isn't yours to where it came from, and you wake up the next morning carrying only what's actually yours to carry. The difference in morning energy levels is something empaths describe as almost miraculous, though Jung would point out there's nothing miraculous about it. You simply stopped carrying weight that was never yours. The seventh and final ritual Jung identified was what he called the sacred pause, and of all the practices, this one requires the least time and produces perhaps the most profound results. The sacred pause is a 3 to 5 second gap that you insert before responding to any emotional stimulus throughout your day. Someone tells you something upsetting. Pause. You walk into a room with heavy energy. Pause. You feel a sudden wave of emotion that seems to come from nowhere. Pause. In that brief pause, you don't analyze. You don't strategize. You don't try to figure anything out. You simply create a gap between stimulus and response that gives your conscious mind the chance to catch up to what your nervous system has already detected. Jung found that empaths operated almost entirely in a stimulus-response loop with no gap whatsoever. Emotional input arrived, and they reacted instantaneously, absorbing, responding, caretaking, adjusting. There was no space between the world's emotional demands and the empath's automatic compliance with those demands. The sacred pause creates that space, and in that space, something extraordinary happens. You get to choose. Instead of automatically absorbing someone's anxiety, you pause and recognize it as theirs. Instead of immediately rushing to fix someone's pain, you pause and ask whether fixing is what's actually needed or wanted. Instead of unconsciously matching the energy of every room you enter, you pause and maintain your own frequency. 3 to 5 seconds. That's all it takes. But Jung observed that those seconds were the difference between an empath who was controlled by every emotional current around them, and an empath who could navigate those currents with sovereignty. The sacred pause doesn't block your empathic abilities. It puts you in the driver's seat of those abilities. You still perceive everything. You still feel the full spectrum of what's happening around you. But you're no longer a passive receiver being overwhelmed by incoming signal. You're a conscious being, choosing how to respond to what you perceive. That shift from passive to active, from reactive to responsive, is the single most energy-preserving change an empath can make. Because reactivity is exhausting. It burns enormous energy. Conscious response, even to the same stimulus, costs a fraction of what unconscious reaction demands. Here's what Jung found when empaths adopted all 7 of these rituals consistently. The transformation wasn't gradual in the way most psychological changes are. It was surprisingly rapid. Within the first week, empaths reported noticeable differences in their baseline energy. Within 2 to 3 weeks, people around them started commenting that something had changed. Within a month, empaths described feeling like a completely different person, not because they'd changed who they were, but because they'd finally stopped the constant energy hemorrhage that had been draining them since childhood. They discovered that underneath the exhaustion they had always known, there was a reservoir of energy they'd never been able to access because it was being consumed before they could use it. Jung emphasized something important about these rituals that separates them from generic self-care advice. These aren't luxuries. They're not indulgences for sensitive people who can't handle the real world. They're operational necessities for a nervous system that processes exponentially more emotional information than the average person's. An athlete who burns 5,000 calories a day needs to eat differently than someone who sits at a desk. An empath whose nervous system processes the emotional equivalent of 5,000 calories of information daily needs energy management practices that match their actual expenditure. These 7 rituals aren't about being gentle with yourself. They're about being accurate about what your system requires to function at capacity. The reason most empaths have never found practices that actually work is because they've been given advice designed for people with normal sensitivity levels. Meditate, take a bath, practice self-care. And those suggestions aren't wrong, but they're wildly insufficient for what an empath's nervous system actually needs. It's like telling a marathon runner to stay hydrated by sipping water once an hour. Technically correct. Completely inadequate for the actual demand being placed on the system. Jung's rituals work because they're designed specifically for the empath's unique energy dynamics, for nervous systems that scan constantly, absorb automatically, and discharge poorly without specific intervention. If you've spent your life feeling drained by ordinary existence, exhausted by interactions that energize everyone else, depleted by environments that others barely notice, Jung would tell you something that might be hard to hear, but is ultimately liberating. You're not broken. You're not too sensitive. You're not imagining the drain. Your nervous system is doing real, measurable work that costs real, measurable energy. And you've been trying to run that system without the maintenance practices it requires. These 7 rituals aren't magic. They're maintenance. They're what your particular nervous system has always needed and never received. Morning separation to establish your container. Sensory grounding to anchor in your body. Structured solitude to defragment your system. Physical discharge to release what doesn't belong to you. Selective investment to stop hemorrhaging into one-directional relationships. Evening inventory to clear each day's accumulated debt. And the sacred pause to shift from reactive absorption to conscious response. Start with 1. Whichever one resonated most while you were listening, that's probably the one your system is most starved for. Practice it for a week, then add another. Build them into your daily rhythm, not as self-care, but as the operational infrastructure your consciousness requires. Because you were never meant to live at the mercy of every emotional current around you. You were meant to perceive those currents and navigate them with power. These rituals give you back the energy to do exactly that. And when you have that energy, you'll finally discover what your empathic abilities are actually for when they're not consuming you alive. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.